Last week, we got the new cylinder on. This week, we're hopefully going to get the rest of it back together in the four-wheeler, maybe a test start if we're lucky on this. It's going to be interesting and it's going to be a time crunch. See if we get it done. Hey guys, welcome back to part 3 of Project X Engine. This week, like I said in the intro, we are going to try and get that on top of that, and that started and running out the door. Got a heck of a task ahead of us. Now, a couple of things that we are going to be replacing, we're actually doing with the cylinder head here. Bronco sent us valves, both intake and exhaust side for this, with the gasket kit. We've also got new seals for it too. On top of that, we've got an oil filter, and while we've got the cylinder head off, we may as well replace the coolant temperature sensor with it. So, let's get started on this. First thing that we're going to want to do is we're going to want to go ahead and remove the valve spring keepers and get those off, so that way we can pull out all the valves and start putting the new ones in. When it comes to the cylinder head here, there is the valve springs and there's grooves in the valve here. This tip that you see sticking out, that is the top of the valve itself. There's a couple of grooves in there, and there's keepers that are basically at an angle that receives into this flat part right here. That's what holds the valve spring on. That's what puts this assembly together. So we're going to pull all of these out. We want to keep track of where each valve spring and keeper went, as well as the retainers, to make sure that we put it all back together in the same spot. Just like what we did in terms of keeping track of push rods and rocker arms. So I've got a valve spring compressor, works great. It's going to allow me to pull this apart. The grooves in this are what line up in the valve, and the taper on this is what holds that inside that valve spring retainer. Now that we've got all that out, we can just go ahead and slide the valve out. Okay, now that we've got the last valve out, we are going to replace the valve seats. Nomura sends us new ones. Here on the exhaust side, it is just the seat. On the intake side, there's actually a valve stem seal in order to help prevent oil from running down into the cylinder. So we're going to replace those, and the cylinder head will be ready to go back on as soon as we pop the valves back in. As I mentioned before, Bronco sent us new engine valves. With a new top end, may as well have new valves in it. Now, when you look at these, intake is always the bigger one, the exhaust is always the smaller one. So there's a couple of things that I want to do with this as I'm assembling. First off, put a little bit of oil on the valve itself. Once again, all this stuff is dry. We want to make sure that it doesn't start up that way. Next up, I'm going to put the valve in and make sure it slides in easy, and it does. It moves nice and easy. It's catching on the seal there. So it moves pretty good. And the other thing I want to look at is we've got just a little bit of room here, and we're in good shape with that. So next up, you don't need to lap these valves in, but I will take and give them a spin. So then I push the valve back down, and I'm just taking a peek to make sure that it's making contact all the way around. I look at both the valve and the cylinder head, and it looks like we're in good shape on that. Exhaust, gonna be the same thing. Give it a little bit of oil. Slide it in. Make sure, like I said, that there's not play from side to side. Give it a little spin while you're pulling on it. And you can see that there's a line around there that shows me that we're making pretty good contact all the way around. Do the same with the other valves. We're gonna put the springs on. We're gonna get ready to go back together. We've got our seats in. We've got the new seals on here. Time for the springs, retainers, and keepers on it. The new valves are in. Springs, keepers, retainers, those are all assembled. Next up, it's time to put the cylinder head on top of the block, which we're good and ready here. We'll put the gasket on and we'll make sure that we pay attention to where these dowel pins are. Those line up with the bigger holes right here. That makes sure that the head stays centered in the right spot. Head bolts, we are going to put these in. Polaris recommends that you put a little bit of oil on the threads and underneath the washers here, so that way we can make sure that we get the proper torque. So we're going to do that. We're going to put all the head bolts in, and we're basically just going to tighten them down with our fingers using the socket here, so that way everything's seated there, and then we'll start to go through the torque sequence. Got the cylinder head on, we've got the bolts finger tight down a little bit better than that. Now it is time to torque them down. Now the pattern that you typically want to go in this is you always want to go from the center out, so that way as you do stuff like that, it basically flattens things out. So we'll do this one, then we'll go to this corner, then this corner, that corner, and that corner. So once again, center out with that. On top of that, the torque spec for this is 35 foot-pounds plus 90 degrees. And in that, Polaris actually tells you to let it sit for a minute between the 35 foot-pounds and the 90 degrees. So let's go ahead and get this tightened down then. And now we wait. Now that we waited the minute, we are going to turn these another 90 degrees each. Push rods and rocker arms are the next thing to go back in. Now, that being said, remember, the way we took them out is the way they've got to go back in. These get torqued to 20 foot-pounds. On top of that, we want to make sure that we put oil on both ends of the push rod and put a little on top of the rocker arms too. That way, once again, nothing is starting dry. Next up, rocker arm cover. Now in that, they do include a new O-ring. And the way you're gonna tell where it's gonna go and how it goes in, there is a notch right here. There's an added little bit of rubber there. So make sure those line up, put them together. line it up. And we'll use the original bolts to bolt it back down. So before we put it back in, it's just going to be easier to do them here. We're going to change out the oil filter. Bronco supplied us with a new one because, hey, we're doing the top end rebuild. We should probably put fresh oil and a fresh oil filter in there. Same thing, we are going to do the water temperature sensor here too. Before I put the new oil filter on, I am going to put some oil in it to make sure that all the pleats are soaked. The sooner we can get oil through the engine, the longer life it's going to have and the happier it's going to be. Last time, you remember when we pulled this out, we noticed a few motor mounts had some issues, so we're replacing those. Simply enough, they just screw into the bottom of the block on this side, the other side bolts to the vehicle. Car arm cover's on, the oil filter, coolant temperature sensor. Everything else is pretty much buttoned up that we're going to put on while it's on the bench. So I guess it's time for it to go back, it's going to go back home. Engine's in, engine mounts are tightened down, starter's gonna go in. We're actually gonna take care of a lot of the stuff real quick here, just because of the fact you guys saw me take it out. Pretty sure if you watch that other video in reverse, you'll be able to see how it goes back in. Let's get to work. Got the exhaust manifold on, I've got the starter on, I've got the intake, I've got the throttle body, I've got the injectors, I've got the plugs in, I've got it filled with oil. But there's a few other things that we need to get done before we can go ahead and kick this thing over. And we need to get the coolant topped off. We need to get a couple of hose clamps to replace on that. I also want to make sure that we get that clutch set up on and intact so that way we can start this thing and get it moving. You don't typically want to start a new engine and just let it sit there and idle. You want to start it, let it get up to temperature, but you want to start to let it move. You want to vary those engine speeds quite a bit, especially with it having a new top end on it. That being said, I'm really excited to hearing this thing kick over next week. Hope you guys tune in. I'll see you then.